July 30th, 1945. Pitch-black night in the Philippine Sea. Hundreds of sailors bob in the oil-slick water, clinging to scraps of debris. All around them, dorsal fins cut the surface. Every few minutes, a scream pierces the darkness and then abruptly stops. This is no horror movie. It's the real nightmare faced by the crew of the USS Indianapolis. Torpedoed at midnight, their ship vanished in 12 minutes. Nearly 900 men now drift helplessly under a moonless sky in shark-infested waters. Over the next 4 days, they will endure a trial of unimaginable horror, relentless shark attacks, brutal exposure, thirst, madness, before a chance rescue plucks the few survivors from the sea. Only 316 out of the 1,195 men who sailed on Indianapolis survived to tell the tale. How did this tragedy happen, and what does it reveal about survival, accountability, and the human spirit? To understand how the sailors of Indianapolis came to be stranded in a living nightmare, we must go back to the waning days of World War II. In mid-July 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was on a top-secret mission. The ship had raced from San Francisco to the Pacific island of Tinian, carrying precious cargo, components of Little Boy, the first atomic bomb used in combat. The crew themselves had no idea what they were delivering, only that armed Marines guarded a mysterious crate in the hangar. Indianapolis set a speed record to Pearl Harbor and arrived at Tinian on July 26th, completing its secret mission in record time. With the cargo safely delivered, Captain Charles B. McVeigh III received new orders: proceed to Guam, then on to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to join the fleet for expected invasion operations. The war was nearly over, but the sea was still dangerous. On July 28th, Indianapolis departed Guam alone, unescorted, steaming west toward Leyte. Captain McVeigh, following standard orders, zigzagged at his discretion to evade submarines, until night fell under heavy clouds, when he ceased zigzagging due to poor visibility. Unknown to him, a Japanese submarine, I-58, was lurking in the area. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of Tharn 58 spotted the silhouette of a large American warship just after midnight on July 30th. In the calm darkness, Hashimoto maneuvered into attack position, and at 23:56 on July 29th, by the ship's log shortly after midnight July 30th, he fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the unsuspecting cruiser. The fate of Indianapolis was sealed in that moment, even though her crew wouldn't realize it for a few seconds more. A little after 0:14 a.m. on July 30th, the first torpedo slammed into Indianapolis's starboard bow. The explosion blew the bow open in a thunderous blast, killing dozens of sleeping men instantly in the forward compartments. Seconds later, a second torpedo struck near the middle of the ship, right by the powder magazine and fuel tanks. A maelstrom of fire and shrapnel ripped through the cruiser as aviation fuel ignited in a chain of explosions. The massive ship literally split to its keel. Within moments, Indianapolis was mortally wounded and began to list heavily. "We knew we were in trouble," recalled Ensign Harlan Twible, a 22-year-old officer. With the bridge in chaos and no official order given, Twible took charge and shouted, "Abandon ship, follow me." He leapt into the ocean, and hundreds of sailors followed, swarming off the decks into the sea as the ship's bow sank deeper. Inside the failing vessel, Chief Warrant Officer Leonard Woods remained at his radio post, desperately attempting to send an SOS distress signal even as water surged in. Indianapolis had lost all power, and its communications were down, but still Woods tapped out a mayday into the void while the ship was tilting crazily beneath his feet. Within just 12 minutes of the first hit, the proud cruiser rolled completely onto her side. Sailors clung to rails that were now nearly horizontal. Captain McVeigh stayed on the bridge until the last possible moment, helping as many men as he could, before climbing out and walking along the hull as his ship capsized. At 0:25 to 0:27, USS Indianapolis's stern rose briefly out of the water, and then the ship slid under the waves, disappearing into the black depths of the Philippine Sea. Approximately 300 men went down with the Indianapolis in those first minutes, killed by the blasts, trapped below decks, or unable to escape the sinking hull. But miraculously, about 900 crew, the majority, survived the initial sinking and found themselves flung into an endless ocean. It was shortly after midnight, and the sea was chaotic with debris, oil, and thrashing men. Many sailors, including Twible, were wounded or burned from the explosions. Coated head to toe in thick fuel oil, they tried to wipe burning diesel from their eyes and mouths. Some men had life jackets, but many did not. In the darkness, small groups of survivors began calling out to each other, gathering around whatever could float, a few half-inflated life rafts, floater nets, or simply clusters of men in life vests clinging to one another. Initially, there was shock and disbelief, but also hope. The men were certain that the Navy would realize Indianapolis was in trouble and send rescue by morning. After all, the ship had gone down so fast that hardly any formal distress call got out, but surely someone would notice the missed check-ins or pick up a mayday. In those first hours, adrift in darkness, many of the crew remained relatively calm, encouraging each other that they just had to survive until daylight. Everybody was scared to death, Twible admitted, but there wasn't any fighting, any turmoil, initially. Little did they know that a chain of errors and oversights in Navy communications would mean no one was coming, not for a long while. The survivors were utterly alone, 280 miles from the nearest land, castaways in an unforgiving sea. When dawn broke on the first day, July 30th, the men of Indianapolis faced their predicament in stark clarity. In the merciless light of tropical sun, they could see hundreds of their shipmates spread across miles of open water. Some were badly injured, bleeding, burned, or with broken limbs. All were covered in black oil from the ship's fuel tanks, which left an iridescent slick stretching to the horizon. Ensign Twible, one of the highest-ranking survivors, immediately tried to impose order. He organized the roughly 325 men nearest him into a group, the largest of several clusters of survivors. Throughout the morning, these men lashed themselves together with belts and lines or held onto a few floater nets to avoid drifting apart. Twible instituted shark watches, posting men at the edges of their group to kick and punch at any unwelcome visitors and keep everyone close together. They had already glimpsed dark shapes circling below. The ocean's most feared predators were starting to arrive. As the sun climbed high, the heat became torment. The Philippine Sea offered no shade and soon turned oppressively hot, like a mirror reflecting blinding light onto the bobbing sailors. It was like having your head in the middle of a mirror, remembered Signalman Third Class Paul McGinnis, describing the sun's brutal intensity. Men's exposed skin blistered and burned under the tropical sun. The ocean's surface heated up, making them sweat, but the nights would be the opposite, cold and shivering. Dehydration set in quickly. Floating in salt water under a tropical sun, the survivors became desperately thirsty within hours. They had almost no food or fresh water. Indianapolis had sunk so swiftly that there had been no time to deploy life rafts stocked with provisions. A few men managed to grab canteens or found crates of provisions that bobbed to the surface. One Marine, Edgar Harrell, stumbled across a crate of potatoes in the wreckage, but they were rotten through. I peeled the skin back as far as I could and squeezed the potato to get a little piece, he said of his meager find. Others shared a few crackers or cans of Spam scavenged from floating debris. These scant rations were nowhere near enough. By the end of the first day, many survivors' lips were cracked and tongues swollen from thirst. And then there were the sharks. Initially, the predators took those on the periphery. Survivors in the water would suddenly hear a blood-chilling scream and a frantic splashing, and they'd turn to see a thrashing body or a red bloom spreading in the blue sea. The oceanic white-tip shark, an aggressive species common in those waters, had arrived in droves. Tiger sharks, too, may have joined the feeding frenzy. At first, the sharks feasted on the dead bodies floating in the area. There were many. But as time went on, the hundreds of sharks became bolder and began attacking the living. All the time, the sharks never let up, remembered Boatswain's mate Second Class Eugene Morgan, one of the survivors. Morgan and about 14 others were clinging to a large cargo net with flotation buoys. Suddenly, as he described, 10 sharks hit it and there was nothing left. The entire group of men on that net was devoured in seconds. This went on and on and on, he said grimly. Men in the water tried to maintain tight circles, lashing their legs together or huddling back to back, kicking and shouting to ward off attacks as if forming a human fort. It helped. Sharks are less likely to attack a tight group, but whenever someone drifted away from a group or floated off alone in delirium, the sharks would seize the opportunity. By the second day, July 31st, hope was turning to despair. Many of the men expected rescue ships or planes to arrive by now, but the horizon remained empty. What the survivors did not know was that multiple errors back at Naval Headquarters had left Indianapolis's disappearance unnoticed. No one in the Navy even realized the ship was missing. As the hours crawled by, the ordeal began to take a psychological toll. The combination of severe dehydration, exposure, and traumatic stress was driving some sailors into hallucinations and madness. Machinist's mate, second-class Granville Crane, recalled how men who drank salt water went insane. They'd be so crazy, they'd be fighting amongst themselves and killing one another. In the throes of saltwater delirium, some men imagined fantastic sights. Crane described men seeing things that weren't there. They'd say, "The Indy is down below, and they're giving out fresh water and food in the galley," and they'd swim down, and a shark would get them. In these hallucinations, a mirage of salvation lured sailors to literally dive to their deaths. Comrades watched, helpless and horrified, as sharks circled below and picked them off one by one. Hallucinations could spread like a contagion through the desperate men. In one large group, a survivor began babbling that he had found the stern of the sunken ship just beneath them, intact and full of fresh milk and water. Delirious with thirst, some men believed him. One by one, they slipped off their life jackets and dove below the surface in search of an imaginary galley, and never came back up. Others became paranoid or violent, armed with knives or bits of wreckage. Crazed sailors sometimes turned on their own friends, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. Friendly fire incidents occurred as delirious men imagined their shipmates were Japanese soldiers attacking them. The psychological trauma was as dangerous as the sharks. Those still sane did their best to keep their comrades awake and oriented, talking, praying, slapping those who started to drift into stupor or delusion. But with each passing hour, fewer and fewer men remained alive and lucid. Night brought temporary relief from the sun, but introduced new agonies. When darkness fell on those interminable nights, the ocean turned cold. Men in the water had little insulation. Soaked through and exhausted, they began to shiver uncontrollably in the tropical night air. Many succumbed to hypothermia, losing consciousness and slipping under, never to wake. Others simply drifted away in the darkness without anyone noticing until daylight. Throughout those nights, the survivors huddled together for warmth and comfort. Some sang hymns or softly prayed, their voices carrying over the dark water. Others could only listen to the endless splashing and the occasional horrifying thud of a shark strike in the blackness, followed by screams. Ensign Twible's group worked to maintain morale. He led prayers and repeatedly assured his men that they would be rescued, though privately he doubted anyone would come in time. Twible took drastic steps to preserve his men's will to live. Whenever a man died, Twible ordered that the body be untied from the group and set adrift. The survivors grimly pushed their fallen friends away into the darkness. It was an agonizing decision, but necessary. Keeping the corpses nearby not only attracted more sharks, but served as a constant demoralizing reminder of their own likely fate. They had to focus on surviving until help arrived. If they had known that help would not arrive for days, perhaps many more would have lost hope, but hope, however thin, was all they had. By the third and fourth days, August 1st and 2nd, the sea had become a graveyard. By Thursday morning, August 2nd, the dead outnumbered the living, notes one account starkly. Of the approximately 900 men who entered the water, hundreds had already perished from their wounds, drowned, or been eaten by sharks. Many others were alive but in critical condition, barely clinging to life on sheer willpower. A Navy report later estimated that the majority of those lost had actually died of exposure, dehydration, or saltwater poisoning, not shark attack. Still, survivors would forever remember the terror of the circling sharks as a defining horror of their experience. It is likely the worst instance of sharks feeding on humans in recorded history. By some estimates, between a few dozen and up to 150 men were killed by sharks over those days. The ordeal of the Indianapolis survivors stands as the deadliest shark attack on humans ever documented. Yet amid this hellish scene, acts of courage and resilience shone through. Men helped each other stay alive in whatever ways they could. They shared the last sips of fresh water from a found canteen. They took turns supporting comrades too weak to swim. Some, like 17-year-old Seaman Second Class Dick Thelen, found a reason to keep fighting. "When I wanted to give up, I saw my dad's face, and I wasn't going to give up for him," Thelen said, remembering his promise to return home. In the face of almost certain death, most refused to go quietly. They fought the delirium, fought the sharks, fought to remain alive one more hour. Never, ever give up would become the survivors' mantra, words spoken decades later by Felton Outland, a sailor who survived that nightmare. Through 4 days and 5 nights, the men of Indianapolis hung on to life with unimaginable tenacity, even as their numbers dwindled with each sunset and sunrise. After nearly 5 days of living hell, the climax of this saga came with the rescue of the survivors, a moment of salvation as dramatic as it was long overdue. Around midday on August 2nd, Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn's sighting had been the first spark of hope. As Gwynn circled overhead, the men in the water erupted in joyous chaos. "I hear a plane!" Marine Corporal Edgar Harrell shouted hoarsely on that 4th day. Those who could still move waved, splashed, and even prayed aloud in euphoria. Gwynn dipped his wings to signal he had seen them and began dropping life rafts, water, and supplies. Harrell recalled how the plane initially flew past and nearly missed them, prompting the men to scream and splash in desperation. At the last second, the pilot banked around and rocked his wings, the sweetest signal the survivors had ever seen. "We began to pray. Everything," Harrell said of that moment, his voice choking with emotion. One by one, through the late afternoon and night of August 2nd, the rescue operation expanded. The Catalina seaplane piloted by Lieutenant Marks, now floating on the swells, became a beacon of hope as crewmen pulled survivors aboard. Marks radioed that so many were suffering that he was taking the unprecedented step of landing to save lives. Permission or not, he was already down. As darkness fell on August 2nd, the Cecil Doyle arrived and deliberately pointed its powerful searchlights straight up into the sky, a glowing lighthouse to guide other rescue ships to the area. Throughout the night, rescue teams worked frantically. Sailors and medics hauled emaciated, oil-blackened men out of the water. Many of the survivors were barely conscious, drifting in and out of hallucinations. It was often hard to tell who was alive and who was dead among the floating mass. Men had to be lifted gently to avoid killing them. Some were so weak that a rough grab could break their skin or limbs. At the height of the rescue, flares lit up the night, and small boats crisscrossed the area, plucking groups of survivors. The ocean that had been a void of despair for days was now teeming with reassuring lights and the sounds of human activity. Engines, voices calling out encouragement, the thunk of survivors being pulled into boats. Many rescuers openly wept as they tended to the men, horrified by the condition they were in. The survivors' eyes were sunken, their skin covered in thick oil and peeling away from sunburn. They were severely dehydrated. Some couldn't even speak, their tongues swollen in their mouths. In total, 316 men were rescued alive. One additional sailor survived the sinking but died immediately after rescue, bringing the often cited number to 316. When day broke on August 3rd, U.S. Navy vessels scoured the area for any last survivors, but by then, only bodies remained. Nearly 900 had gone into the water. Around 584 had died in those horrific 5 days. Survivors of the USS Indianapolis on Guam in August 1945, after rescue. Emaciated, covered in oil, and many barely conscious, the 316 rescued sailors were immediately given medical care for severe dehydration, hypothermia, shark-inflicted wounds, and saltwater poisoning. The Navy delayed announcing the loss of Indianapolis to the public for 2 weeks, until August 15, 1945, the day Japan's surrender was declared, virtually ensuring the news would be overshadowed. For the men who were saved, the ordeal was over, but a new battle was just beginning. They were shipped to naval hospitals on Guam and in the Philippines to recover. Many were in critical condition, drifting in and out of consciousness for days. Nurses had to pry their mouths open to give sips of water to mouths caked with oil. Some men were temporarily blinded by fuel oil or the sun and had to have their eyes bandaged. Others suffered from ghastly wounds or infections that set in during those days afloat. But they were alive. When the survivors first met Captain McVeigh on the hospital ship, they saluted him despite their condition. A moment filled with emotion as McVeigh broke down in tears, apologizing to his men. The rescued sailors soon learned that while they were fighting to survive, the world had moved on. Just a few days after their rescue, on August 6th and 9th, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the very weapons Indianapolis had helped deliver. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, officially ending World War II. In the midst of VJ Day celebrations, the Navy quietly released the news of Indianapolis's sinking. It was buried in the newspapers, largely overlooked by a world rejoicing that the war was finally over. The saga of the USS Indianapolis did not end with the rescue. It shifted to hospitals, inquiry rooms, and courtrooms, leaving lingering questions of military accountability and profound psychological scars. The survivors, once they recovered enough to travel, were sent home on leave. They returned to a country that largely had no idea what they had just endured. Their story was not widely known at first, suppressed under wartime secrecy, and then overshadowed by the war's end. Many of the young sailors struggled with severe post-traumatic stress. For a long time, they could not talk about what happened. Harlan Twible, the young ensign who had led a group of survivors, later admitted that for years after the war, he tried to forget the whole nightmare. He didn't even discuss it with his wife. It was simply too painful. Other survivors were tormented by survivor's guilt. Why had they lived while so many others died? And recurring nightmares. Even decades later, Indianapolis survivors reported that the trauma never fully left them. More than 68 years after their rescue, nightmares are common, wrote one reporter in 2013. Lowell Cox, a survivor, described a dream he has often. He's lost in a big city, searching anxiously for his buddies. He finds one, then loses him, then searches for another. An endless, futile hunt. "I suppose that means I'm back in the water again, looking for someone on my team," Cox explained of his subconscious horror. The psychological wounds ran deep for the men of Indianapolis, and healing was a slow, uneven process. Amid the survivors' private struggles, a very public controversy was brewing. The U.S. Navy, stung by the loss of Indianapolis and the egregious delay in rescuing her crew, looked for someone to hold responsible. In November 1945, just a few months after the sinking, the Navy convened a court-martial, an almost unheard-of action for a ship sunk by enemy attack. Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, who had commanded Indianapolis on her final voyage and survived, was put on trial. He faced 2 charges, failing to order abandoned ship in a timely manner and hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. McVeigh's own sailors were stunned. They considered him a victim of circumstance, not negligence. In their eyes, he had fought to save the ship and then shared their ordeal. But the Navy went forward with the trial. McVeigh was acquitted of the first charge. Everyone recognized there hadn't been time to properly abandon ship in the 12-minute sinking. On the second charge, however, he was convicted. The Navy declared that by not zigzagging at the time of the torpedo attack, McVeigh had hazarded his ship. This verdict was controversial from the start. In the court-martial, even the Japanese submarine commander Hashimoto was called to testify, and he stated that zigzagging would not have saved the Indianapolis, given how perfect his firing solution had been. McVeigh had in fact been sailing under orders that left zigzagging to his discretion, and he was not informed of any specific submarine threat in his path. Many felt that McVeigh was being made a scapegoat for larger failures higher up the chain of command. As later noted in Congress, of the hundreds of U.S. Navy captains who lost ships in combat during World War II, McVeigh was the only one court-martialed for it. The Navy perhaps sought to deflect blame from its own operational mistakes, like the failure to note the missing ship. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific commander, understood the injustice. He quietly remitted McVeigh's sentence and restored him to duty soon after. McVeigh was even promoted to Rear Admiral when he retired a few years later. But the damage was done. In the public eye, McVeigh was officially to blame for the tragedy of Indianapolis. Some families of the lost crew vented their grief and anger at him for years. "Merry Christmas. Our family's holiday would be a lot merrier if you hadn't killed my son," read one cruel card McVeigh received. These personal attacks and the weight of guilt took a terrible toll. For decades, McVeigh carried the burden of being labeled the man who lost Indianapolis. In 1968, at the age of 70, Charles McVeigh died by suicide, a toy sailor from his childhood clutched in his hand. It was a heartbreaking coda to the tragedy. The captain survived battle in Sharks, only to become another casualty of the Indianapolis saga, driven by guilt and despair. It would take over 50 years for McVeigh's name to be cleared and the record set straight. In the late 1990s, an unlikely champion emerged, an 11-year-old boy named Hunter Scott, who chose the Indianapolis story for a school history project. Scott interviewed survivors and pored over documents, bringing fresh attention to the old injustice. Around the same time, survivors of Indianapolis, determined to honor their captain and shipmates, joined with Captain William Tody of the modern submarine USS Indianapolis, SSN 697, to lobby Congress for McVeigh's exoneration. The movement gained momentum, and in 1999, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee held hearings on the matter. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the former Japanese sub-commander, even wrote to support clearing McVeigh's name before he died in 2000. Finally, in October 2000, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution stating Captain McVeigh is exonerated for the loss of Indianapolis. President Bill Clinton signed it into law, and in July 2001, the Secretary of the Navy officially cleared McVeigh's service record of wrongdoing. It was a long overdue vindication. The surviving crew of Indianapolis, by then elderly men, rejoiced that their skipper's honor was restored. They had always known the truth. Now history would record it too. The story of the USS Indianapolis is one of heroism and horror, of a joyous mission's end transformed into a nightmare at sea. It remains the worst sea disaster in U.S. Navy history in terms of lives lost from a single ship. Yet, out of that darkness emerged powerful lessons about survival, accountability, and the human spirit. The Indianapolis crew's ordeal showed the extremes of what men can endure when pushed by fate. 4 days of living hell that tested not only their physical limits, but also their faith, loyalty, and will to live. Survivors later said it was their camaraderie and determination that kept them going. Thinking of family back home, as young Dick Thelen did, or finding strength in each other, as Twible's group did, made the difference between giving in and surviving. The survival instinct burned strong in those men. Even as sharks circled and death seemed certain, they refused to surrender. Never, ever give up was the lesson one survivor imparted to future generations. Their tenacity turned a potential total loss into 316 lives saved, each survivor a testament to extraordinary resilience. The Indianapolis tragedy also prompted critical changes in the Navy, ensuring that no ship's non-arrival would ever be ignored again. In direct response, the Navy implemented the Movement Report System, requiring constant tracking of ship movements so that no ship that fails to arrive in port goes missing without notice. This was a hard-earned improvement, paid for in the blood of Indianapolis's crew. It stands as a lesson in military accountability. The disaster was not solely the result of enemy action, but also of complacency and communication failure. Recognizing these failures has helped make subsequent generations of sailors safer. For the survivors, the decades that followed were marked by remembrance and healing. They formed the USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization and gathered for reunions, finding brotherhood and understanding among the only other men on Earth who knew what they had been through. At these reunions, nightmares could be spoken of, tears shed, and also laughter shared. Telling their story became a mission to honor their 879 fallen crewmates and to educate the public. In fact, a pop culture moment unexpectedly brought their story to millions. The 1975 film Jaws featured a chilling monologue by a character who was an Indianapolis survivor, describing the shark attacks. That scene, delivered with haunting realism by actor Robert Shaw, reawakened interest in what had been a somewhat forgotten tragedy and indirectly set the stage for the push to exonerate Captain McVeigh. By the 1990s and 2000s, books, documentaries, and memorials finally gave the Indianapolis the recognition it deserved. In 2017, a research expedition funded by philanthropist Paul Allen located the wreck of Indianapolis on the Pacific floor, 18,000 feet down. The discovery, 72 years after the sinking, brought closure to some survivors and families. The ship was found resting peacefully, a war grave encrusted in deep-sea silence. In 2018, the crew of Indianapolis, living and deceased, were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest honors, in tribute to their sacrifice and service. Today, the USS Indianapolis National Memorial in Indianapolis, Indiana, stands etched with the names of those who sailed on her final voyage. Visitors who pause there can read the long list of names, 1,195 in total, and reflect on the magnitude of the loss and the courage of the survivors. The Indianapolis story resonates as a powerful narrative of psychological trauma and healing. It reminds us that war's casualties are not only those who die in combat, but also those who live with its ghosts. It prompts tough questions. How could the Navy have left those men adrift for so long? What burdens do leaders carry in wartime, and how do we assign blame in the chaos of combat? Ultimately, the exoneration of Captain McVeigh reaffirmed a principle of fairness and understanding, acknowledging that sometimes tragedies are not the result of one person's failure, but a convergence of cruel circumstances. As we remember the Shark-Infested night, we honor the men who faced the abyss with astonishing bravery. The legacy of USS Indianapolis is one of warning and inspiration. It warns us of the costs of complacency and poor communication. It inspires us with tales of men like Twible, who risked his life to lead others, Marks, who landed on the open sea to save strangers, and all the sailors who kept each other alive by sheer grit and faith. Their story is carved in history, never to be forgotten. Thank you for listening to the story of the USS Indianapolis. If this journey of courage and survival moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more in-depth documentaries on pivotal moments in history. We invite you to like this video and share it so that more people can learn about the heroism of the Indianapolis crew. Do you have thoughts on this incredible story or suggestions for other topics you'd like to see covered? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, remember to honor the past and those who lived it. Their experiences carry lessons for us all. Stay tuned for our next story, and thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and we'll see you in the next documentary.